Hello. 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 Give me a hello or one or what's up if you're here and you can hear me and we're all good with the audio and if everything's working fine. Hello to everyone. Johanna, Black Sea, Prodaki, Jeffrey, Fancy Nancy, Glorious, Rue Mash, and Just Me. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining for this very lately scheduled, last minute, super tardy. Actually, it's not tardy because I'm not late. I'm right on time actually. But yeah, this late scheduled live stream where we're gonna have a watch back of my Louis XIV and the Nun of Moret video, which I hope you guys will find interesting. Quick question to everyone, really quickly. If you've already seen the video in question, I think the name of it was, I don't know how long this will last. I think that's what I called it because I seriously thought that once I post this video, YouTube was going to find a reason or an excuse to pull it down. And in fairness, it hasn't been that heavily suppressed. So I was actually quite surprised at that. But I think that's actually perhaps testament of the time or the dispensation we're at the moment, where I think that information is just out now, isn't it? But anyway, if you've seen it, let me know in the chat if you've seen it. Or if it's new to you, if you don't know what this live stream's about and you haven't seen the source material already, let me know in the comments. I'm gonna be pretty laid back, pretty lucid with it today. Probably going to be giving a bit more attention to the comments than I normally do. Reason being, I kind of said what I wanted to say in the video already. So if you've seen it, hit up the likes, by the way. Everyone who's here, there's about 50 or 60 concurrent viewers now. So let's all hit up the likes and get this place packed out. But yeah, if you've seen the video already, I've kind of said what I wanted to say. I don't have a huge amount more to add to it. So yeah, I'm not sure how much I'm going to interrupt it today. We'll just kind of see how it goes. It's a bit of a watch party more than anything. I want to say hello to Ashley, Ice T, Terence, Joy, Khalid, Mbaye, Talia. Yeah, hello all. I'll be surprised if there are people in here who haven't seen it, or at least regulars, because it's not like one of my, most of my videos when I put them out these days, unfortunately, 10 to 20K are pretty decent. Unfortunately, that used to be a small amount of views for me, but I'm quite heavily suppressed now, so it kind of is what it is. So occasionally when I have videos that reach near or exceed 100K, that's quite a big deal. So this video, I think, is sitting on about 68K views or something like that, which is quite high. So, and interestingly, it's not it's not that negatively viewed. And I thought, given how controversial the topic is, it'll be one of those ones where I've got videos that are far less controversial that I've got far more negativity on them. This one, not so much, which is surprising. I found even people who aren't regulars on the channel and who aren't black actually are quite positive to this video. So it's interesting. It's interesting. YouTube always does surprise you when you put content out in terms of how it's received by people. So yeah, there you go. But yeah, hello all. Chickies, Zehoven, Pac-Man, Papa, and Wesker. What's going on? Okay, we've got quite a nice little crowd forming here. And I think on that monumental note, we have 66 in the live stream. I think we could start the video really, unless anyone's got a particular, particularly important question or something they wanted to highlight before we get started. I think we just start. We'll let the video flow. We'll let it go, and we'll just I'll take queries and I'll pause it if I've got anything to expand upon. But like I said, I'm not sure how much I'm going to add because like I said, most of the research is in the video itself. So there you go. Carol, thank you. I said I've always got great information. I appreciate that perspective. Really appreciate that. Katrina, how are you doing? You're not late. You're good. We haven't started yet, so you're very good. Christian, how you doing? Ifioma, how are you? Let's get started. Okay, cool. That's the niceties out of the way. Let's get this show on the road. Let's get this party started. So let's full screen it. I can full screen it because it's my video. So no issues there. All right, let's get going. Oh, by the way, when I get started, I'm going to let it play. And I won't stop it unless you guys give me a 2. So I'm going to let it play. Hit 1 if the audio is good and everything's fine. If there's any problems with the audios and you can't hear it, give me a 2. And I'll stop it and I'll figure out. I'll troubleshoot. So there you go.
Do you know the name of this bubbly, eccentric, early modern era ruler? For history buffs, the over-the-top coiffure of this iconic extrovert should be instantly recognizable. And indeed, if you said, I know that person, it's most certainly King Louis or Ludwig XIV. You would be, possibly, but not absolutely, correct. However,
here's my first pause. Those of you who know when we discuss these subjects about black presence in Europe, I always talk about some of the various obvious, the very obvious hints. And to me personally, I think hair is one of them. The hair of monarchs in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern era doesn't fit to me. We consistently see women being depicted with these afros, which isn't a hair texture really compatible with the modern European form factor. And you also see men with hairstyles like this very often, and it raises a big question mark. It's the same texture that you see, I've mentioned before, in the wigs that you see in on judges and on barristers. The texture of the wigs seems to mimic afro or afro type hair, and it raises a humongous question mark for me anyway. Personally, it raises a huge question mark because I'm like, it doesn't fit. It actually doesn't fit. So where did they get these hairstyles from? So anyway, I just thought I'd raise that since we had some portraits of Louis XIV on the screen. But yeah, let's carry on.
After this presentation, you may find any controversy regarding his appearance may lean more toward the subject of his identity than his bountiful hair. For, in recent years, startling discoveries continue to be made by researchers that are uncovering surprising insights that force us to question the known depictions of the king and perhaps revise everything we think we know about modern era history. So, where to begin this tale? A possible starting point could be to review the hidden birth of a possibly illegitimate black child at the Palais du Louvre, Paris in 1664. Louise Marie-Thérèse, who bore both the names of King Louis and that of his wife, the Queen Marie Theresa, had a birth shrouded in controversy.
I'm going to pause it there again. So, Louise Marie-Thérèse is the name of the child. And this, to me, even today, is very puzzling because lots of people really speculate about the nature of this child, obviously who ended up become the nun of Moret. She clearly bore the name of both the king and the queen, and yet we're led to believe the child was illegitimate on one side or the other. And yet none of the none of the kind of like hallmarks of illegitimacy follow her. She carries the royal name, which is a massive like while they give her the royal name. But there is the issue that it seemed that she was being hidden. So the question mark about why she was being hidden really is the question that we have to figure out here. Was it illegitimacy? Was it for her safety? Was there some kind of issue? Some people have actually raised the possibility that as early as this time, the Bourbon family was in a little bit of crisis with the state, and they were trying to protect Louise Marie Therese. I don't know. I look for the primary evidence, and I'm still doing research on this. And obviously, if you think you have any theories about this, feel free to share it. But I'm looking for the primary evidence on this to see if we can extend this story, because it would be nice to have a quite a clear thesis about exactly who Louise Marie Therese was. My gut says that she is the legitimate child of both the king and the queen, and there's another untold kind of strand of history that we're not being told here. But that's the question that a lot of people have kind of postulated, and so far I haven't. At least I've heard answers that sound sensible, but I still need more evidence before I'd be able to or be willing to kind of share that with anyone in the community. But yeah, there you go. Yeah.
In short, she was rumoured to be a love child belonging to either the king or his wife.
So I just want to quickly jump on this comment really quickly that Wayne's left, because I recently did a reconstruction of Queen Elizabeth I, which got people really upset, as you can imagine. Even people on this channel, really faithful subscribers, people don't like this subject of black nobility. They think I'm reaching, think I'm going too far. I don't think so. And I wouldn't share it if I didn't think it was true. And I did it based on the underpainting of one of her portraits where the National Portrait Gallery x-rayed, and there's basically a dark-skinned woman beneath Queen Elizabeth I, who kind of is similar in form to her, but clearly a different person. And I did my reconstruction based on this. And Wayne's rightly said here that she was known. I'm not going to try and change the literary record. She was known for whitening her face, but we must understand in the context of lightening her face what that actually meant. Now, we've been given the idea that she was already white and she used to make herself look like as white as a ghost. And obviously we have all of these portraits to support that. Whereas I'm more on the suggestion that she was swarthy, because that's how she was described, i.e. kind of medium to dark skinned. And she used to lighten her face to make herself appear more light-skinned, So there's a lot of evidence, and actually Dave McRitchie touches on this, that colorism was really rampant in Europe amongst even the black populations in Europe. Colorism had seeped its way in quite heavily. So this is before racism. There was colorism. There was this kind of like, because of this growing non-black populace, there was this idealization of lighter skin that goes back several hundreds of years. So that's really quite interesting. So I'm glad that Wayne just touched on that. It's a little bit of a segue from the video, but I just wanted to kind of like touch on that comment that you left there, because I'm kind of I'm kind of on the same line as you there. But anyway, carry on.
This has inspired a wave of recent historical conspiracy and revisionism fueled by modern prejudices. Some questionable revisions are now weighted towards the theory that the child indeed may have belonged to the Queen, with people suggesting an affair with a 3-foot palace pygmy, Augustine, who was known as Narbo. This might seem a far-fetched and ludicrous claim to the logical mind, but unfortunately, European historians have learnt that any explanation is valid to explain away the inconvenient occurrence of blackness of monarchs and nobility in history.
And I just want to add to this point here, because I had to touch on this, because obviously the Louise Marie Therese is very inconvenient to, you know, European history. She's a very inconvenient character. They always have an excuse when black people occur in nobility, like the De Medici family, where a lot of them look mixed. They'll say, "Oh yeah, well there was a slave mother or a slave father." Or so. They couldn't really say a slave in this case because it's kind of like you can't accuse the queen of sleeping with a slave. So then they go, oh, "Okay, well it was a pygmy, you know, one of her palace pygmies." It's like anything to any claim, no matter how ridiculous. And this whole palace pygmy thing was actually circulated very recently. So it's all in the 20th and 21st century, circulated by British historians. They're the ones who pushed this whole thing out there of, oh yeah, it was Narbo, her palace pygmy. And they touched on it later in the video, the fact that they don't even like the suggestion of saying that she had an affair with the 3-foot pygmy. So they started putting out the idea that he inseminated her unknowingly, you know. So basically that, you know what that means. Yeah. So this is what they're claiming, that the 3-foot palace pygmy had his unwarranted way with the queen, and that's how she ended up having given birth to a jet black, by the way, very dark skinned child. Not jet black, but you know, very dark skinned child. This is the mental gymnastics that they go through in order to deal with black nobility, which appear quite sequentially, even in spite of their best efforts to whitewash history, these inconvenient black nobility keep popping out here, there, and everywhere, and these inconvenient descriptions of people keep popping out, and they can't hide them, so they just make stuff up, and they really, really hope they just throw enough doo-doo at the wall. They hope that eventually it's gonna stick. So I had to mention that, obviously, because we need to know what is the mainstream narrative behind this, and that's it. That's if you want to know the mainstream narrative behind the birth of Louise Marie Therese, yeah, it's that she's a child of the queen, okay, the White Queen, who was graped by the 3-foot palace pygmy from Africa, of course, because where else would the palace pygmy, the 3-foot palace pygmy from Africa? This is, this is what we have to go through as melanated people in this world, living with dishonest people. It's kind of like, really, do we? I mean, I don't need to expand on that. It's just like, come on, man, seriously, do better.
If that wasn't enough, some commenters have even suggested she was unknowingly inseminated at the hands of the playful imp, as he would spend extended lengths of time under her skirt. I kid you not.
So it's interesting. He'd spent extended lengths of time under her skirt. So what did he have, like a turkey baster or something like that? And he kind of like he was changing the oil in the car. It's like come on, man. These people are insane. They're absolutely bonkers, man. But anyway, it's their insanity that forces us to research deeper. So it's kind of like they create the rope for their own neck in the end. So whatever tickles their fancy,
Not. This conclusion has been seriously considered. Fortunately, however, we will be looking at the contemporaneous evidence more objectively and proposing a much more plausible explanation. An explanation reflecting the common belief at the time, which laid suspicion more firmly at the feet of the king himself, King Louis XIV. Louis XIV went by the moniker of the Sun King.
And I just want to add to that again, sorry, I don't want to cut in too much, but I do want to add to that. What you'll find is contemporaneous. You'll never find that you have too much of a problem with the contemporaneous descriptions of what took place. They're always logical. It's kind of like, well, what you'd expect. It's kind of like everyone was saying, oh, it's the king's daughter, it's the king's daughter, it's the king's daughter. Everyone accepted that. And what you'll find is the modern descriptions, they're the ones that are pseudo. So it's the modern revisionists, the people right now who need history to fit in this nice little lily white box, and all blacks are from Africa, transported as slaves and what of no. They're the ones who will create these revisions, and they will haplessly trample all over the written record. Okay, they'll do it. They'll just trample all over the written record that exists. They don't care. They'll throw it out. You've seen them do it with ancient Egypt. You know, with Herodotus becomes a loony man because, you know, that one statement where he said that the Egyptians were black with woolly hair. It's like, oh no, Herodotus was crazy. No one takes him seriously anyway. You know, it's the constant need to make history fit this new paradigm that they've created, even if it means completely trouncing the known written record that exists. You know, this is what they do. It's very, very frustrating. Can I give a quick thank you to Octothorpe with a cool name? Peace to you and the chat. Peace to you, my friend, and thank you for your very generous donation. It's really, really appreciated. I hope that you're enjoying it. McFat said only 52 likes, 150 in the chat. Let's hit that like button. I think I'll agree with that. And we're going up. We're approaching 160. But let's carry on. Thank you very much, Octothorpe.
Perhaps coincidentally, this title is also reflected amongst the Incas. It, in itself, seemed to be quite a flamboyant and tropical title for a European ruler. Louis chose the sun as his personal emblem. According to Chateau Versailles, the sun, being the symbol of Apollo, god of peace and the arts, is also the star which gives life to all things, rising and setting with unfailing regularity. What perhaps did not fit this image was an illegitimate love child, and the suggestion of things chose the sun as his personal emblem. According to Chateau Versailles, the sun, being the symbol of Apollo, god of peace and the arts, is also the star which gives life to all things, rising. Louis chose the sun as his personal.
Sorry,
Louis XIV went by the moniker of the Sun King. Perhaps coincidentally, this title is also reflected amongst the Incas.
Yeah. I don't know how I missed that. Sorry, guys. You're wondering why we're looping that much. I did want to pause on this because I only let this pop up in the video. I didn't want to expand on it. But it is amongst the Incas, one of the only other places where we hear people calling themselves the Sun King. And the reason that's relevant is because amongst the Inca rulers, we actually do have European rulers. And one of them, you can't see it here. I'm not going to zoom in. But one of them over here is Carlos Quinto or Charles V. In fact, why not? Let me get a better image. I'm sure I could find that. Okay. Inca rulers. Yes, I'm talking about the Inca rulers of America here. 1 second. Inca rulers. Let's just have a look at images. Here it is. This is the one I was looking for. I'm trying to find one that's not cropped. Bear with me. I can show this one actually. So this is the open. I'm just going to open this image in a new tab and drag it over. Just bear with me. So this is what I popped up on. Sorry, 1 second. Open image, new tab. So an image here. Okay, well, I won't just open the image, but that's fine. So yeah, let me zoom in quickly. This is the one I popped up, and this guy over here, Carlos Quinto, that's Charles V. Now, you'll notice that the Inca rulers are all melanated, yeah? And I'm sure people have seen this before. So this is the Inca king list. But this is Carlos Quinto, who was a Spanish ruler. So he was Spanish monarch at the same time that he was Inca ruler. And you can see he's depicted here as a very swarthy, let's use the word swarthy, let's be consistent, a very swarthy man. So I only popped that up on the screen because I didn't want to extend on it in this video because I didn't want the video to go too far left. But I wanted, this idea that these things that we're coming up with are crazy is is not, you know, it's not so much the case. You know, there's evidence. So I'm just trying to remember where. One second, I just want to remember where Charles V ruled from. 1 second. Okay, so there's Aragon. So I always thought it was Spain, but someone said German. So he was the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. So he was the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and you could be right. It might have been from Germany, where he's ruling from. But there you go. But yeah, so anyway, so the fact that he called himself the Sun King, the whole reason I raised that is because the Sun King wasn't some foreign term. And if you actually look up the etymology of Sun King for Louis the 14th, they won't make any mention of the fact that the Sun King was the term given to the ruler, the Inca rulers. That link is never made. It's kind of ignored, and yet it's something that would have been known contemporaneously amongst the European monarchs at that time. I just think it's worth stating, it's worth knowing, and it's probably worth exploring as a possible idea for where this moniker came up, rather than this assuming that it was just something that was random and that was pulled out of the sky. So yeah, just thought that would be relevant to mention. 1 second. Let's see, someone said something quite interesting. Let's see if I can get up on the screen. Yeah, that's it really. Okay, cool. Let's carry on.
It in itself seemed to be quite a flamboyant and tropical title for a European ruler. Louis chose the sun as his personal emblem. According to Chateau Versailles, the sun, being the symbol of Apollo, god of peace and the arts, is also the star which gives life to all things, rising and setting with unfailing regularity. What perhaps did not fit this image was an illegitimate love child, and the suggestion of one will be substantially denied by those eager to preserve a more conventional narrative, not involving black children born out of wedlock, even if it means blaming it on the actions of a playful African pygmy. Do we have evidence for the version of events supporting the child belonging to the king? Well, first there is the claim that, among other things, the king bore a startling resemblance to the child, which was noted by Voltaire in his works titled Le siècle de Louis, which translates to the century of Louis XIV. He states,
"It was suspected with much likelihood that a nun of the Abbey of Moret was his, the king's daughter. She was extremely swarthy and resembled him. The king gave her 20,000 écus for a dowry, placing her in this convent."
So here we have evidence that the king supported her upkeep, suggesting quite clearly that he was taking personal responsibility for the child's nurturing, something no male monarch would do for a child resulting from the acts of a philanderous wife. His generosity to her is detailed in a letter sent on June 13, 1685, by the Secretary of the House of the King to Mr. de Bezons, General Agent of the Clergy, regarding the pensions patent of £300 granted by King Louis XIV to the nun Louise Marie-Thérèse on October 15, 1695.
Just going to pause it there to just highlight a statement that R.J. Mackenzie has said. But it sounds you've said it in a really kind of like plain and crass way, but it's just the fact, okay? If Louis XIV had intercourse, I'm going to change the word banged there, I feel like it's a bit uncouth. We're trying to be quite respectful here on the King's Monologue. Had intercourse, found himself to be in intercourse with a black woman, the child would be light-skinned. I think we can all agree that that's the case. Yeah, I think we can all agree that a child would be light-skinned. And we know that, okay? Now, obviously, there is the occasions when you get throwbacks and things like that. We know that these things are possibilities. So no one's saying it has to be the case. But if we'll go on the, on the work with all likelihood, if we'll go on the cause of, the balance of probabilities, we know that it's going to be a light-skinned child, at darkest a medium-skinned child. As dark as she's being depicted, she's like being depicted with a similar complexion to my own, I think that is a ridiculous assumption to make. So even the whole idea of Louisa Marie Therese being mixed race, I think that's a reach. And I think that European historians who are claiming she's mixed race, they know it's a reach, but they can get away with it because, hey, she's black, and we always explain, you know, inconvenient blacks with an affair with a slave, or an affair with a maid, or an affair with a pygmy. You know, that's how we always explain it away.
Stating it was to be paid to her all her life in this convent or everywhere she could be by the guards of the royal treasure, present and to come. This brings us to the appearance of the child. She is described as swarthy, and not just swarthy, extremely swarthy. So what exactly does this frequently used word mean in context? For a definition, we can refer to Webster's 1828 English Dictionary, which reads, being of a dark hue or dusky complexion, tawny. In warm climates, the complexion of men is universally swarthy or black. Their swarthy hosts would darken all our plains, black as the swarthy African. In support of this definition, the 18...
And I find it really funny how when it comes to all dictionaries, like contemporaneous dictionaries, so we're talking about late 18th century, early 19th century, there's even a 17th century dictionary. I just find it quite ironic that they all seem to be Afrocentric. I don't know if everyone's noticed that. Like all of these dictionaries, Webster's, Collins, Johnson's, they're all Afrocentric because they all agree with the definitions for words that we put out there. We say, well, Moor means a black man. It doesn't mean a Muslim. The dictionaries say Moor means a black man. It doesn't mean a Muslim. The modern historical revisionists say Moor means Muslims, got nothing to do with black people. We say the word swarthy means black. It still means black in German. It still means black in Dutch. It still means black in Danish, you know, Svart, Swart, Schwartz. It still means the same thing. But the English derivative swarthy doesn't mean black. It means someone with a really like tan, like the Irish are called swarthy. The dictionaries all say swarthy means black. Swarthy means a Negro. Why is it that all of the contemporaneous evidence is Afrocentric? Why is it that all of the dictionaries, contemporaneous dictionaries that actually give you the etymology of the words and the origins and then cite several examples are also Afrocentric? And by the way, I'm using the word Afrocentric ironically here, like, you know, the word woke, you know, they all seem to be on our side, and yet we're gaslit or led to believe that we're the ones, oh, why are you trying to write yourselves into our history? What? All due respect, why are they using the word swarthy to describe a black woman, a dark-skinned black woman in this video, and then using it to describe the king, and you don't have any issue with that? If you are really on the hunt for truth, like a lot of these people claim, you should raise a question mark and say, actually, you know, you do have a point in that they're describing this clearly dark-skinned black woman with a word that they're also describing the king with. So that at least deserves a bit of an investigation. Surely you'd do that, yeah, wouldn't you, if you were out for truth? But if you were out for you're just out to obfuscate, or you're out to deceive, or you're out to preserve a version of history that is, you know, fulfilling to your ego, and you don't like what we're discussing, then I can totally understand it. I can somewhat empathize with your need to claim that we're reaching, but I don't feel like we are. In fact, I don't think we're reaching far enough, if I'm going to be totally honest with you. So Factin, thank you for your $5 donation. It says, how do white people get hair like this? Is one of the great mysteries. I'm so glad you said this. How do white people get hair like Louis, whatever his name is? That's not normal, is it? I've never seen them do that. How did they get straight hair to be so curly for so long? Ask a single non-melanated person to do their hair in the style of Queen Elizabeth I. Ask them. Or Mary Tudor. Say, do your hair in that exact style. I want to see you get those curls, those crisp, kinky curls she's got in her short hairstyle, which they all seem to have. I want to see you do that with your hair. Please do it with your hair. Ask any non-melanated man. Say, hey, I want you to make that big judge's wig, the big curls, yeah, the long, bushy, curly, full body. Do that. Show us how you do that. How is it? It's a good question. Okay, it's a good question. And RJ has rightly responded. By the way, thank you for the $5 donation. RJ has has responded and said they're going to say it's a wig. Well, then my response is going to be straight away. Once again, it's the ancient Egypt argument, isn't it? They say the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't their hair, they wore Nubian wigs. So my instant answer is, why Nubian wigs? Okay, if they're the high culture, why you make wigs in the style of your hair? Yeah, so if it was a wig, then why are Europeans also making Nubian? We might as well call them Nubian wigs. Why are European monarchs wearing Nubian wigs? Isn't it interesting how all of these ancient societies style seem to revolve around the Nubian? When I say the Nubian, I mean in the broad sense of the term, not the specific ethnicity. But isn't it funny? Isn't it funny that that's the case, isn't it? But yeah, we're reaching. Don't worry, guys. We're just. I'm gonna carry on reaching now. Anyway, let me let it play.
1927 Johnson's dictionary defines swarthy as dark of complexion, black, dusky, tawny. The swarthy Africans complain, though in torrid climates the common colour is black or swarthy. The definition of swart reads black, darkly brown.
And as you notice, there's no swarthy means black, darkly brown, tawny, also slightly tanned. There's no slightly tanned there. Oh, black of hair. Swarthy means a black of hair. Any complexion, black of hair. No. None of that. None of that. It's really quite clear. Very, very clear. It's talking about complexion. Okay? Of swart, complexion. Okay? I don't think there's any ambiguity here. And obviously, we know we're 150 years out of actual King Louis here. So that's the other argument that'll then be made. Oh, well, these dictionaries came later, blah, blah, blah. But if you look at all of the contemporaneous usage of the word swarthy, i.e. if you find pieces of literature that are dated contemporaneously, they only use swarthy to describe identifiably black people. It always refers to Africans or Moors or people who we know were black. So there's just no, if you ask them to provide the evidence that they demand from people like us when we're reading it literally and saying, well, this sounds like this, so I think it's a fair a fair conclusion we're drawing here to at least question why they're calling the king swarthy. If you ask them to provide evidence, say, okay, cool, you're saying swarthy means a light tan and black hair. Okay, show me. We know you can't show me in the dictionary because the dictionary agrees with us. So show me a contemporaneous statement that I can easily say you're describing a swarthy person here, and that person who is swarthy is definitely white with a tan. Ask them to. Have fun with that as well, by the way, because you won't get very far.
Brown, tawny, of swart complexion, whereas I was black and swart before. The definition of swarthiness reads darkness of complexion. So, as you can see in contemporary literary citations, the definition of swarthy is consistently applied as a measure of complexion, akin to blackness and Africanity. Now, compare this with what we are led to believe about race relations between...
And I just have to state really quickly, I use the word African a lot in this video, but I must state, I think I was quite clear, but I'm going to be quite overt with it now because people raised accusations before. I'm not saying the black people in, who I'm referring to are Africans. Let me make that very, very clear. Or at least everyone's an African, but they probably are the least African because I'm pressing on the fact that many of these people are the indigenous people of these regions, or at least related to the indigenous people. Some of them might be related to Moors, so might be more recent Africans, but some of them may be indigenous people to the region. But what I'm not saying is that they're all, recent African migrants. That's not my argument. But the fact that African is being used as a comparative source, we have to then mention now, because that becomes clear. It feels like, oh, if the dictionary didn't say black as the swarthy African, it said black as the swarthy European, then where would we be? I'm actually grateful that the dictionary says black as the swarthy African, because if it said black as a swarthy European, even though there were clearly black Europeans or swarthy Europeans, can you imagine how the Eurocentrists would then use that to then say, oh, see, rubbish, swarthy means white. Do you understand? So the fact that the dictionaries made that distinction is actually beneficial, and it's actually in our favor. Okay, it's actually in our favor.
Between Europeans and Africans during that time period, and it becomes glaringly obvious that we are quite probably being grossly misinformed by the mainstream historical narrative. In addition to this, and even more surprisingly, Louise Marie-Thérèse is stated to have resembled him because, and not despite, her swarthiness. To reiterate, Voltaire reads,
It was suspected with much likelihood that a nun of the Abbey of Moray was his, the king's daughter. She was extremely swarthy and resembled him.
And as you can see, by all accounts, the child appears to be entirely, not partially, black, as one would expect from a mixed-race offspring. She was surely not the result of an affair between a wholly white monarch and an unnamed black other. St. Simon's account of Louise Marie-Thérèse reads,
It seems that in this convent there was a woman of colour, a Moorish woman who had been placed there very young by Bontemps, valet of the king. She received the utmost care and attention, but never was shown to anybody. When the late queen or Madame de Maintenon went, they did not always see her, but always watched over her welfare. She was...
So just to be clear there, the queen looked over her as well, according to St. Simon's account here. So it wasn't just the king. It's clear that she had visits from both the king and the queen. We have that from two different accounts. So it's very, very clear that both parents visited this, this nun at the convent. So there's, that's a lot of attention for a child who's allegedly a bastard. One has to certainly admit is the case. Also, someone did mention this, RJ, it's worth mentioning, the fact that they've described her as a Moor in one of the descriptions. And once again, the word Arab has not been mentioned, but, surprise, surprise, she's a nun. So we know she's not Arab and we know she's not a Muslim. And yet she's being described as a Moor. So that's once again more weight towards the evidence that we already knew, that the word Moor was used to describe dark-skinned, people, dark-skinned Europeans, people who are phenotypically black very lightly, but definitely people who were dark of complexion is certainly the case. So yeah, spot on. Someone said, didn't Chief X debunk this? I'll have to watch that. That'd be hilarious. Chief X couldn't debunk a bunk bed. Yeah, well, I'll check that out just for shits and giggles.
was treated with more consideration than people the most distinguished, and herself made much of the care that was taken of her and the mystery by which she was surrounded.
Not only this, but even more tellingly, the locals seemed entirely unfazed by this rumor of this child's heredity. Indeed, most being comfortably convinced that this black woman was indeed the daughter of the king. It was not only believed by the public, but truly believed by Louise herself. Voltaire states,
Madame de Maintenon, on a trip from Fontainebleau, went to the convent of Moray, and wanting to inspire more modesty with this nun, she did what she could to debunk the idea which nourished her pride. Madame, the nun told her, the trouble which a lady of your station takes to purposely come here in order to tell me that I am not a daughter of the king persuades me that I am. The convent of Moray still remembers this anecdote.
And a believable quip it was. Indeed, if the locals...
And also, I think I left it out just for the sake of brevity. I think, I'm not sure if it's in that same quote, where she used to refer to the king's children as her siblings. She'd refer to his son, certainly, as her brother, quite openly, and they used to kind of want to keep her on the hush. So it's really interesting. It's just really interesting. I still haven't figured out fully who she is in terms of how she fits in and why she was hidden. But the evidence, obviously, like I keep saying, is that she's being visited by both, and her identity is being clearly obscured by the royals for a reason that we are not sure of at the moment. Now, obviously, a lot of people will say, well, the obvious reason is that she's black and they were all white. And, I would beg to differ based on the rest of the evidence that's going to come out in this video. But it's certainly something. Once again, I can't rubbish anything until we have full weighted evidence and on all sides, and then we can decide which version of history sounds the most plausible given the evidence that's placed in front of us. Yeah, let's carry on.
Along with this very black woman, were entirely convinced of her royal heredity. It certainly does bring into suspicion the ethnicity of either, or indeed both, the king and the queen of this late 17th century French dynasty. Indeed, a portrait of her still exists in the Charles de Bruyère Museum in Remiremont, simply named The Moor of Moray, and it's confirmed to have been painted around 1680 by the same hand which painted the series of 22 pastel portraits of kings of France, from Louis IX to Louis XIV, between 1681 and 1683. Quite an honor for an illegitimate child indeed. Let's explore further literature and see what it suggests. For centuries now, eyewitness descriptions of the king describe...
And I let it play past that, but I think it is significant as well. We're really fortunate that the artists used to do a lot of these depictions of these who otherwise these people essentially would be nameless blacks, like a lot of the people who are painted. They have their identity stripped. We don't know who they are. But we're very fortunate when some of these paintings are done by famous royal portraitors, because then they become harder to ignore. It becomes easier for us to put them in a time frame, and it also becomes easier for us to draw links, because once again the coincidence of her being painted by the unofficial royal portraitor as a random nun in a convent is very, 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 very small. It's very small. So once again, just that act of the fact that she's been painted by a famous portrait artist who painted the royals instantly really adds massive amounts of credibility to the likelihood of her being of royal blood. It boosts it up massively. So yeah, that's just an interesting kind of side note, but important to note there.
Describing him as certainly melanated, at least by modern standards, were largely ignored as they plainly contradicted the abundance of portraiture clearly.
I just want to pause to quickly say a quick thank you to Sir Facton. It says, look at that hair. No way in the world that belongs to a pure breed white man. He has to have native African in him. I'm of the impression that this entire portrait is just either a whitewash or a total fabrication. I don't think this is what Louis XIV looked like. That's my personal belief. I'm putting it out there. You guys are feel free to believe what you want to, but I think the evidence for me suggests that this is not what he looked like, and that will come up more and more in this video. But yeah, the hair is bizarre, and the question then is, well, why did they keep, if they were going to whitewash, why did they keep the hair? And there's a very simple question to this, because this is a pattern that you see throughout portraiture during the kind of like early to late modern era, is that they had to keep the hair because they knew that if they completely altered the presentation of these royals, then the descriptions, the discrepancies between the descriptions would be huge. But also, and this one's probably even more important, is that they won't match the coins. Okay, so this is quite important. They can take a coin and they can pass a coin off with a black man's face and saying, well, it's not a black man, it's just the coin's worn out. But you have to explain when that coin has a big, massive afro hair or big, wavy, big curls. You have to explain, well, why does the way you've depicted the king in these portraits look completely different? So there was this acknowledgement, at least I believe, amongst that kind of like this process of whitewashing to preserve certain elements of the art. It made sense for them to preserve certain elements of the art because it meant that things will still match. When you have, books and books and books being written about Louis XIV and describing his big curly hair, if they decided to turn it all straight, then that would be a complete mismatch. And so I believe that this was understood, and it was understood to not change the hair of the subject. It was kind of like an unwritten rule of, whitewashing a subject. Once again, that's just my, that's my conclusion based on the research that I've done. There obviously is no book written about whitewashing, probably because of Operation Legacy. But yeah, so that's all speculation, and I admit that I put my hand up. But at least that's where evidence leads me to.
Depicting him as anything but that. Indeed, King Louis XIV is a frequently illustrated individual with a somewhat peculiar but instantly recognizable look. But let's see how eyewitness descriptions compare with these paintings of the so-called Sun King. Richard Wilkinson, in his biography of Louis XIV, describes him as follows.
So, what did Louis XIV inherit from his parents? Actually, he most resembled his Bourbon grandfather. Louis XIV's swarthy complexion and prominent nose were typically Bourbon.
Once again,
so swarthy, okay, it's key. All right, guys, it's certainly key. We have to raise the question as to why all contemporaneous sources point to swarthy being a description for essentially dark-skinned African people, and also use it for the king. So anyone who's going to dissent the information that's being put out by this video and by this documentary, they have to address that claim, and they can't address it using contemporaneous definitions of the word swarthy without providing citations of the word being used in a like manner. Because otherwise, then what are we doing here? Let's just we can say swarthy means anything. We can say swarthy means green. We're the ones who are providing the evidence for what the word means. And contemporaneously, even extra, it in the modern world, it's still being used to describe very black people, such as the case of Zwarte Piet, and I think that's in Dutch, yeah. So that's in Holland. So Zwarte Piet, where they have that celebration, and he's a black man. And we have Schwarz in Germany, and there's plenty of other European languages. It's a Germanic word at its root, and the Germanic languages still use it for black. So you can't use we're talking about Louis XIV here. So English is it's not even that important. So there you go.
We can remind ourselves that swarthy translates to darkness of hue, darkness of complexion, or black as an African, if we're to take the definitions from both Webster's and Johnson's early dictionaries literally. In addition to this, in The Present State of Germany, published in 1738, it is said of the Habsburgs, the lineage from which Louis XIV descended through his mother, Anne of Austria, that a swarthy complexion and thick hanging lips, which last, as some will have it, is the distinguishing feature of the Austrian family.
Now, what's funny, obviously, many of you guys will know, is that the Habsburgs are, the way they explain away this depiction of the Habsburgs is if you look at any pictures, so if you was to Google, Habsburgs, you'll see that they all depicted the same way. They have prognathism, and very thick bottom lip, and they'll basically say they all look this way because they were all inbred and they were all disabled. But we know as melanated people that it's perfectly normal for people to have prognathism and thick lips. But these descriptions are so weighty, and these descriptions are so kind of like exaggerated that they couldn't simply ignore them, because everybody noted the fact. They said this. I mean, the quote here says it was a distinguishing feature of the Austrian family. So it's very well known, Habsburgs, thick hanging lips, swarthy complexion. This isn't something they could just readily ignore. And so it had to be accepted, it had to be explained, and it had to be kind of written into the history. And hence we have, like someone's mentioned there, Surfactant's mentioned Habsburg jaw, which is basically, it's prognathism. Now, they will argue that it's a prognathism of the mandible, which is fair, which is the lower jaw, okay? But it's actually prognathism of both in the case of the Habsburgs, because they've pulled up their bones and they actually have it's subnasal prognathism, but they've argued that it's a prognathism of the mandible, which caused their lower jaw to jut out, but their maxilla was kind of recessed. And I think there's a little bit of coping in that. I think there's a little bit of coping in the way they've exaggerated the level of prognathism, because they have these thick lips. Actually, if you pull up a picture of a Habsburg royal, you'll have a laugh, because it's kind of like they'll show you these white people with these incredibly thick lips. It's kind of like, well, how does that work? It's interesting to know. Let me just give a quick shout out to Surfactant and about a $5 donation. Thank you. He says, swarthy in a time when only serfs and slaves spent time in the sun. Got it. The gaslighting is real. It is. It's amazing how in a time when, they will tell you that blue blood means that someone had the most pale skin. Their skin was so pale that their veins would show through true blue. That's what blue blood meant. Okay, that's the time that we're talking about here. Yeah, we're talking about a contemporaneous period here, and yet we're having royals, not just royals, but an entire royal lineage, the Habsburgs, who essentially ruled most of Europe, being described as swarthy in complexion. Make it make sense. Tell me, when did these super pale, these super pale, pure of blood royals rule, and where did they rule? Because from what I can see, we just seem to get recurring events of people being described as swarthy throughout the middle, as well, throughout the early and late modern era. So it's just, it's just interesting to note.
These sentiments were repeated in the life of Leopold, dated 1706, where the Habsburg nobles were once again described as having a brownish complexion and the underlip hanging down very much.
And just a quick one now, sorry, Surfactant again, sorry. I'll come back to it. I'm not gonna interrupt again for a little while after this, but he said more like blue black blood, and I'm sure most people on the live know that the Old Norse word to describe black people was blaumen, which essentially meant blue men. And that was the way they described people, these kind of like unmixed native blacks who were so black they were essentially blue. To me, that seems like a more plausible reason as to why they said you needed blue blood to rule. It wasn't, once again, this isn't necessarily racial. Let me make this very clear to you, okay? It's about having the blood of the first men. So if the native population are the blaumen, the very, very darkest people who were here first, them saying you need to have blue blood is essentially them saying you need to have the blood of the first men. That's what's logical. Not you need to be so pale that your veins, your blue veins need to show through, because to be quite frank, a majority, loads of, non-melanated people have their blue veins showing through, and we know they're not all of royal blood. That wouldn't have been a very good qualifier. So, it's just interesting. Anyway, let's carry on. Thank you very much, Surfactant, for your donation.
Now, it's fair to say the prominent terms used to describe his appearance, being swarthy, prominent-nosed, and possibly with thick and hanging lips, are quite notable. It's also substantial that Wilkinson clearly makes reference to the entire Bourbon family line as being swarthy by stating these as typically Bourbon features. On a side note, the British biscuit, Bourbon creams, are a classic and favourite amongst biscuit lovers in the UK. They are possibly the UK's darkest biscuit, being a deep dark brown dark chocolate biscuit. The interesting fact being they are not...
Now, I'm going to mention really quickly, I'm a fan of Bourbon creams. Okay, yeah, I have with my cups of tea, being the very English person I am. Now, Bourbon creams, to be very clear, I'm not making a contemporaneous link here because they are a relatively recent invention. I think they came out in the early 20th century or something like that. The point I was making about Bourbon creams here is that Bourbon creams, and this is researchable, are named after the Bourbon royal lineage, i.e. the French royal family. So the question that I'm asking here is why, when they created this biscuit in the early 20th century, where we're not at the early 20th century, we're not too far from the French Revolution, so many people would have been contemporaneous or aware of the French Revolution and of the Bourbon lineage, why they chose to take this very, very dark, almost black biscuit that they've created and call it Bourbon. We know from the French Revolution, it's probably likely that it would have been a slur. I'm assuming it would have been some kind of a slur, some kind of a, maybe a bit of an, because the French royal family weren't looked on favorably, or at least the Bourbon lineage weren't. It could have been a slur, some kind of, but why would they take this dark biscuit and then call them Bourbon creams? To me, once again, it's logical. It's logical if you're thinking that. It's not logical, obviously, if you're not. So a lot of people will look at that and say, well, that's a reach. But I'm like, well, give me a better explanation then as to why. Because it's not because the bourbons like chocolate yeah, anyway. That's for you to look up anyway.
Not coincidentally named, but rather they got their name directly in relation to this particular royal lineage. Similar to the family of dark brown spirits, also referred to by the same name, but surely this is all just a coincidence. Let's continue. James Peller Malcolm, in his 1802 work, Londinium Redivivum, states,
Louis XIV had arched eyebrows, aquiline nose, and brown complexion.
Now bear in mind, prior to the modern invention of race, it was entirely normal to describe someone literally by their physical appearance with no aspersions of inferiority or even ethnicity tied to these descriptions. Conjecture aside, there certainly seems to be a consistent theme forming, that being authors wanting to communicate the rich, full brown tone of his skin. Remember, swarthy was the same word used to describe his dark brown-skinned daughter, of whom we have portraits proving she was not the pale cream of her father's, alleged, portraits that some are trying to attribute to the word. On reflection, it seems these portraits of the king are clearly incompatible and cannot possibly be attributed to these descriptions. Shall we continue? Let's. Sir Richard Phillips, in the Monthly Magazine, Volume 13, published in 1802, states of the corpse of Louis XIV.
Louis XIV was also in good preservation, but his skin was as black as ink.
Now, to be clear, there is no question that the skin of the deceased is likely to change tone, and this description of the king was taken posthumously, that is, after his death. However, even with that in mind, a description of black as ink seems to be a very extreme expression of petrification for one, who in life was depicted as considerably pale. However, for one who in life had swarthy skin, this change in skin tone seems reasonable, if not expected. With that in mind, as it stands, there seems to be somewhat of a literary consensus about the brownness of the king's complexion that is entirely unrepresented in his publicized portraiture, which I'm sure you'd agree is bizarre.
Now, at that point, I do want to kind of pause it and say, look, that's, 3 or 4 descriptions we have of Louis XIV. Four descriptions you have of Louis XIV. There's a lot of brown and black going on. I think we'd all agree. Yeah, a lot of brown and black going on. So even if you're going to be skeptical towards, this subject, which is, expected for people who haven't been taught any of this, that's something that you have to bring to the fore and be able to be willing to discuss, well, what are the possible reasonings behind, okay, you've got to say swarthy means, he had a very light tan. Well, his portraits don't show him having a tan. They don't look, he just looks like a normal pale person with brown hair. So there's nothing there to suggest that it's got anything to do with being of a, if you're going to argue swarthy means you're of a Spanish tan or of a Arab tan, then show us Arab or Spanish portraits of King Louis XIV. You won't find him. You only find him with relatively pink and pale skin. But then you have to marry that with where he's being clearly described as brown, brown, and not brown in the modern racial sense of the word, the literal word brown. Why is he being described as brown? And why posthumously, possibly a day or a couple of days after he died, did he turn jet black? Once again, if the skin shrivels on a dark-skinned person, okay, what happens is the melanin basically compresses and they will turn black. They will turn darker because just like if you look at if you're dark skinned, by the way, if you look at the skin where your knuckles fold, so on your hands, if you got your hand open, you look where your knuckles fold, where the skin is basically compressed, you'll notice that's darker than the points where the skin is stretched. Okay, and this obviously is exaggerated once one dies and their body becomes dehydrated. Hence, I could quite easily explain King Louis XIV appearing to be jet black posthumously, but you couldn't make the same explanation for someone who wasn't black to begin with, So, yeah, let's carry on.
However, just that observation, even alongside the extreme swarthiness of his daughter, alone is not enough to rewrite the history books. Are there any more turns in this tale that can paint a more agreeable picture of the king's appearance? Turns that perhaps are confluent with the contemporary literature? Well, it's at this point that this story gets even more interesting. This portrait remains one of the earliest known extant portraits of a so-called black man in French painting. It was painted by Jacinthe Rigaud Ros Serra, most commonly known as Hyacinthe Rigaud, a French painter of Catalan origin. It was painted around 1679. Coincidentally, this would have made the official age of Louis XIV around 41 years old at the time of its creation. Interestingly, Rigaud was a French Baroque painter, famous for portraits of Louis XIV himself, amongst other royals, and other members of the Habsburg nobility, and was certainly the most prolific portrait painter during the reign of King Louis XIV. He is considered one of the most notable French portraitists of the classical period. Rigaud owes his celebrity to the faithful support he received from the 4 generations of Bourbons whose portraits he painted, namely King Louis XIV being perhaps the most notorious. Modern curators have simply classified this as a portrait of Balthazar, since, as is the trend, the sitter's swarthiness has relegated them to total anonymity. Unfortunately, black subjects rarely, if ever, retain their true identity. Now, this image by itself is unremarkable in terms of assuming an identity for the king, besides the fact it was painted contemporaneous to his reign by his favoured artist. However, if we revisit the claim by Voltaire, then things do get more interesting. The claim being that his daughter, Louise Marie Theresa, the nun of Moray, was extremely swarthy and resembled him. In view of that, suddenly this portrait takes on a different light. For although she bears no resemblance to publicized portraits of the Sun King, the resemblance to this painting would immediately provide the context for the stated familiarity and the rumors of relation that were accepted as fact by the locals.
Now, this to me, personally, once again, this is a personal thing. We had this discussion. And by the way, I want to give a big shout out to all of my Discord members. I don't know if Wesker's still on the live stream. A few others, Kapruki, I don't want to leave people out, but we do touch on these kind of more controversial topics, and I think of more kind of, you know, gentle ways of easing people into these discussions, because, you know, these kind of talks and, you know, having these kind of subjects come up does scare people. People are very fearful of having these discussions, especially if it's the first time you've heard it. It sounds so wild, or you don't perhaps appreciate the amount of work or research or evidence there is that supports these viewpoints. But the reason I want to shout out my Discord is because this to me was a little bit of a aha light bulb moment when I was doing this research, when I placed these paintings side by side, because it's not just the case, to me at least, that they're both black. Okay, and this is one of those things where I feel like only melanated people will really appreciate the resemblance that's being shown here. I think if you're not black, I could appreciate and forgive the fact that you don't necessarily see if they resemble or don't resemble. I might struggle to pick out the resemblance between two Japanese people, for instance. My eye isn't trained that way. That don't mean it to be racist, but you kind of know what you know about the communities that you're in, you know, your family and stuff like that. So when I saw this image, to me, I was like, they look related. That's what definitely stood out to me. I was like, they look related. It's not just a case of they're both black. It's like they look related. You have eyes that seem to me like that kind of droop out towards the outside, very similar shape, very similar partition between the eyes. The mouths are almost identical. Okay, there's only some differentiation in the nose, his nose being a bit more aquiline at the bridge than hers is, so the noses look different. But other than that, these are two really similar looking people. They look like they're related to each other. They don't look like they're related to me, but they do look like they're related to each other. And so that, to me, I was like, there's something in this, because someone had shared this portrait with me and suggested this might be one that's worth investigating. And I was like, oh, okay, you know, whatever. It's just, you know, it's a black man dressed as Balthazar, which is what they like to do quite a lot. And that's the excuse they're gonna make, or it's a Moorish king, or this, that, and the other. But it was actually the pairing with this portrait that made me say, well, okay, let me look into this further. And then when I looked into it further, you realize that it's painted by the very favored artist that was used by the Bourbon lineage, the Hyacinthe Rigaud, who essentially did all of the royal portraits at that time, and so would have been the perfect person to have painted Louis XIV. And the only thing that we do know is that this portrait is nameless, because we know that every black person who's painted is stripped of their title. We don't know who they are in the end. So to me, there's a lot of confluence, a lot of kind of agreeable happenstance that seem to be lined up side by side to say, there's a theory here. There's a theory here. This is, to me, I was like, this is building up to being quite strong evidence that this portrait might be significant. So that's kind of where I ended up here.
With a detailed observation of the works, beyond them both being of a similar hue, which is not remarkable at all, one can observe that they have an incredibly aligned phenotype, observable in the eyes, nose, and lips being strikingly similar. One could declare a familial resemblance would not be an incredible claim. Let's compound that with the multiple descriptions of the king that we have already visited upon. His deep brown, swarthy complexion, his prominent nose, and the hanging lips possibly inherited from his mother's lineage, even the blackness of his corpse.
And to be clear here, I've said aquiline nose. His nose, I think some people would disagree that his nose is aquiline. His nose is definitely aquiline. It's aquiline at the bridge, particularly for a melanated person. So although he has quite flared nostrils, which is, you know, obviously perfectly, you know, perfectly normal for someone who's of melanated descent, he has a very aquiline bridge. So his nose from the top of the bridge right to the point is very, very straight and very narrow. So that would be described as you would still describe that as an aquiline nose, just to be clear on that.
All become instantly contextualized and reasonable. Could this unnamed sitter, painted by King Louis XIV's favorite portrait artist, actually be Louis XIV himself? His appearance may seem peculiar, particularly in this turban, but the depiction of nobles as Moorish kings appears to have been widespread at the time. Modern interpretations have claimed these are all depictions of black magi's, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art describes this outfit as that of a Moorish king and not a magi.
And just to go back, some of these portraits of these Moorish kings, in an effort to once again discredit the idea of there being any black nobility, even Moorish ones, by the way, some of them, they'll add things like they'll put a collar around the neck and say, oh, well, this is a portrait, a very expensive portrait of a slave who we just decided to depict and dress up, because apparently a big fetish of the early modern era was to dress up and get the most expensive portrait artists in the world to paint your slave dressed up as a king for reasons unbeknownst to any common sense. And obviously in a world that we've been raised in, where everyone's been taught, well, black equals slave or black equals deficient, no one argued with that. But obviously now we have a little bit more access to information, and we can see how people are being described contemporaneously. We can hopefully start to discard some of these narratives that are still being held onto, by the way. Particularly even the British royal family, they hold on to the fact the British royal family actually holds some of these Moorish king statues, and they've added a collar around the neck or a collar around the ankle, and said, oh well, it's just the statue is a statue of a slave who we dressed up. It's kind of like, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. we're smarter than that, but there you go.
In fact, there are numerous portraits and busts dating to the late 17th century, contemporaneous to Louis XIV, showing unnamed Moorish royals wearing almost identical outfits to the one shown in this painting. These busts, ranging from miniature to more than life-sized, are largely concentrated to the Italian region. Could this be Louis XIV homage to a possible Moorish genealogy? This would be consistent with coats of arms of numerous noble lineages depicting Moors' heads, suggesting the genealogy of many of Europe's nobles had Moorish, or at least swarthy origins.
Shout out to Kapruki. If you haven't watched his video, they were called Moors. If you haven't watched his videos, they were called Moors. There's 2 parts. Yeah, you're missing out. Please make sure you do watch that.
There's even more to support this suggestion. In this famous painting of the king, painted by the renowned Hyacinthe Rigaud, we see him wearing his very unique armor, punctuated by the emblems of the sun on the breastplate, with breast articulation styled in the manner of emanating sun rays. This armor was likely designed for the king as an homage to his symbolic role as Sun King. However, and interestingly, there is another painting where identical armor is being worn. Little or nothing is known about the sitter in this portrait. He is simply called the mulatto. As is the case with most black or mixed persons of nobility, he has been stripped of his name, but we've already discussed that.
Isn't it sad that we have to try and guess and figure out who these people are because they weren't even left with their names? It's like someone's come up with a term. I heard the term the other day. Actually, I was on a live stream. Whose live stream was I on? It might have been Trill Black's live stream, but I was on a live stream the other day and someone mentioned the term I've heard many times before. Obviously, it's the paper genocide term, and that I don't think there's a word more fitting to describe what happened to melanated people on the continent of Europe, in America, in Africa, obviously. But yeah, globally, we might as well say it's paper genocide. Is to take, how do you take people and plunge them into complete darkness? Well, this is you're looking at the blueprint here. This is the blueprint for taking the people and plunging them into complete darkness. What do? You take them and you remove their name from everything. You don't even leave their names on their portraits. You leave them with no clue as to who they are. And it's dark, but it's also very significant that this was done. Yeah, it's dark, but it's also very significant that this was done and how this was done. You know, it's when you think about it and the impact that it's kind of had on us. We're looking at these portraits and we're trying to figure out who these people are because they have no name, but no one's turning around and, you know, pointing the finger at, you know, Europeans. No one's pointing the finger at academics and turning around and saying, why did you do this? Why don't these people have names? People in academia should be doing that on our behalf. You know, historians should be doing that. Instead, they are more than willing to take on the slavery narrative, regardless of how little sense it makes so often, rather than allowing or helping us to build back a picture of who these people were. They don't seem to be willing to play a part in that. And I don't know, it just feels like it's very, I feel like it's very significant because it's kind of like a microcosm of exactly what happens to the black population on a daily basis, how kind of like gaslit we are. And we're told to, well, make sense of it, do good, make sense of your life. You do well, go out there and achieve this, that. And it's kind of like, why should we? Like, just tell us just give us his flipping name. Tell us who he is. Do you know what I mean? It's like we're forced to do our own research and put our own clues together, and then people turn around to us and go, "Oh, you're trying to steal our history." It's like, well, if we're doing it wrong, give us our names back for God's sake. Do you know what I mean? It's like if we're doing it wrong and you find this so offensive, why don't you help us to get our names back? Why don't you help us find out who these people are, rather than just simply pointing fingers and telling us, oh, you're doing it wrong? Do you understand what I mean? Because I don't think you want us to know. I mean, I'm very comfortable. I know who these people are. But you can't turn around and accuse black community for being intrigued and being interested in the different theories about who these people are when you're the very people who actually strip these people of their identity. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's a real double standard that we have to put up with. It's incredibly unfair, and I think that we must remember that as well. There's nothing wrong with us exploring the various tenets of our history. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We're doing the right thing. This is what we should be doing. We should be speculating. We should be coming up with. We should be theorizing. You know, we should be creating a Hegelian dialectic approach to all of the information that they've given to us and forming new thesis, new synthesis based on, basically creating an antithesis from everything that they put out to us, because what they put out to us is often incorrect. That's the bottom line. So what we're doing, I feel, is correct, and we need to continue to do what we're doing. It's important. Rant over.
How then can we assert his nobility?
And I'm sorry, I have to touch on what Wayne's touched on here as well, because I can't tell you how significant this is, guys. He says here, this is one of the most realistic portraits of that time. The details still amazed by the artists today. Let me tell you something right now. The process of whitewashing ruined modern era art. Late medieval and early modern era art was ruined by whitewashing. One of the things I haven't touched on is the fact that no one touches on and ignores the fact that most late medieval era and early modern era art nobility looks like it's painted by the same person. And no one, they're all kind of like it's the Fayum mummy portraits all over again. They all look like they've been painted by the same person. Big hint, big red flag and hint there, and they're not very good. If you look at the portraits of Queen Elizabeth, King Richard III, this, that, all of there's so many like paintings and portraits out there that all look really bad, and they all look like they've been painted by the same painter, and that's because it was done in a rush. If you look at the very few actual portraits that haven't been touched and haven't been whitewashed, the detail is always exquisite. like this painting, like the painting of Simonetta della Colavecchio, like the painting of the family I just mentioned, the Italian family, the Medicis, Alessandro de Medici. If you look at the ones that haven't, even the one that I just showed you, of the one that I did, the portrait I believe to be King Louis XIV with the man with the turban on his head. If you look at the detail on them, it's completely different to the detail that you got after, or the post whitewashing ones, where essentially the portrait's been rushed out the door and they don't look very good because they've just taken something that existed and they've painted over it in a hurry, and the artist who did it perhaps was not as skillful as artists who made the original one. So this is a common theme I see recurring, and no one answers the question as to why these portraits that have been painted over several hundreds of years all look like they've been painted by the same portrait artist, and that artist is not very good. You know, there's a reason that happens. In fact, I can think of a scenario that happens in, and you don't have to use too much of your imagination as to how we come to that conclusion. So anyway, yeah, really good point there, Wayne. Let's carry on.
If indeed he is a noble at all, well, certainly the ability to commission a painting of this detail was beyond the means of the general public, but more notably, the armor he wears raises big questions.
Now, I do have to address one thing.
We know that
the armor is not identical, and I did say it's identical in the video, and it's not. It's very close, by the way. And the reason why I initially, in my mind, I was like, well, this is identical armor. I read a couple of books on armor. I don't know if I've got them in front of me right now, but I read in particular a book called How to Read European Armor. And my conclusion was that the differences you see in the two armors here might just be the differences in the artist's approach to how they wanted to draw the armor. Okay, so maybe just adding a little quirk here and there, but they were really, really close. But I will retract the statement that these two pieces of armor are identical. They're not identical. There are differences, and many people would say the difference in the cuirassier is significant enough to not call them identical piece of armor. And I'd be actually happy to retract that and say they're not identical, but they're really very, very close. And if they're contemporary, and given that the armor was like the signature of the king, for them to be this close, you'd imagine that there's some kind of familial, you know, acceptance of the person on the left, for him to wear armor that's that close to the king's armor. But I will definitely retract the statement identical, because it's not identical. It's just exceedingly close. One would argue probably came out of the same facility. That's what my argument would be. I don't think it would have come out of a different armourer, basically.
By the 16th century, according to Donald LaRocca in his book How to Read European Armour, that royal workshops made armour only for the sovereign and members of the court by royal warrant. So armories supplying the royals did not supply the general public. We also know that by this period that, in order to be bulletproof, the thickness and therefore the weight of plate armour became impractical to wear, causing it to go out of use by the end of the 17th century.
It is interesting to note that guns had been invented in this time, and so they had to think about that when they created armor. I just found that quite, you know, it feels like these things are really far away, and it's like, no, the gun was out then, you know, so the armor had to be had a twofold job to do. It wasn't just kind of like this piece that they were wearing for swordplay, you know.
And this lack of utility meant that ceremonial armor was designed for visual impact, to convey luxury and status, rather than for protection. In light of this knowledge that armor played a significant role in both identification and ceremony for the monarch who commissioned it, one can assert that it was unheard of for monarchs, who only donned this type of cuirassier-style armor ceremonially, to ever share it is an impossibility, leave alone with someone not of immediate nobility. So, just who was this sitter, and why does he share the armor of Louis XIV? And that's not all. Another important observation is that when placed alongside the portrait in question, we once again are faced with quite an impactful resemblance. So close, one would not be amiss to assume a nuclear relationship, or even only a separation of age existing between the two subjects.
I'll also retract that as well. I don't think these, I think these look really close, by the way, like incredibly close. If I had a portrait of this person and lightened it up slightly, this is, if I was someone commissioned to kind of like lighten it up slightly, or to kind of like make his image slightly more mild, this is probably where you'd end up. I.e., the lips are a tiny bit smaller, the nose is a tiny bit, it's the same shape essentially, but a tiny bit more mild than the nostrils, and the eyes are a bit smaller, basically. Now, there's two schools of thought here. One, this could be offspring, a mixed race offspring of this person. Two, they could just be some kind of a distant relation. Well, let's say three. Or three, this could be kind of like and this wasn't unheard of, by the way, because this was happening in England at the same time, where people were producing portraits and they were changing the portraits slightly to kind of lighten people up, and so they're not making them white, but they are making them more, I don't know, palatable for either, I don't know if it's for the court or for the public, but they are changing the appearance. Remember, I said colorism was a thing. I'm co-signing the fact that colorism did seem to be a thing that was creeping its way into Europe during this time. And as such, this could be the end result. Now, which of those three possibilities, I don't know. I don't have enough weight of evidence to kind of tell you what I think it is mostly. All I can say is I feel like there's a familial link. I feel there's a strong familial link, but I don't know what that link is. It's kind of like, when I say familial link, it's kind of like, Nigel Benn and Conor Benn. I don't know if you're into boxing in the UK, or even Chris Eubank Jr. Okay. Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn both have white mothers. Okay. But they both look a lot like their dads, but they don't look like their dads because they're not fully black like their dads. They're mixed race, but they both look a hell of a lot like their dads. So that is a resemblance that I could definitely see there. If someone said that was that person's dad, or they maybe shared a dad or something, I don't know. But there's a familial resemblance. That's my point that I'm making there. Thank you to Sir Fatin. He said, I blame us. Too many of us cape for white skin and coon for for snow bunnies. Our greatest strength, acceptance, is our weakness. I think a lot of people would parrot the sentiment that our accommodation, our willingness to accommodate, has been a massive hindrance to our progress. And I think one of our biggest problems is the unwillingness to evolve that accommodating trait that we have. Maybe it's what makes us who we are, but I think the willingness to accommodate our enemies is a bit foolish. So I'd agree with you there. I think this is something that we have to essentially, as a community, work through and figure out when we can be accommodating and when to close doors and to close ranks, which is what I feel is done a lot more effectively outside of our community than inside. So yeah, thank you for that statement. Let's carry on.
What's more intriguing about this portrait is how naturally his hair seems to be in that Baroque royal hairstyle. No longer does the hair look like a bizarre, ill-fitting quirk, but instead, it now falls naturally in both texture and style to the phenotype of the subject. Can you
I have to say too much there, guys. Look how naturally that fits. Look how naturally that hair fits. Doesn't that hair just look right on that subject, as opposed to this hair, which just looks like, what the hell is going on?
Suspend your disbelief briefly and assume that this image presented could be the real face of a Bourbon royal? Could this leap of faith actually provide a logical explanation to the puzzling and conflicting data we hold about the Sun King? Our final piece of evidence lies in this portrait, presumably painted by Marie Victoire Lemoine in the late 18th century. Once again, the sitter is unknown, but people have suspected this is another Bourbon royal, this time possibly Louis XVI or his son, the tragic boy King Louis XVII. Similar to the portraits we have already discussed, this portrait has a strikingly close proximity to the royals in terms of its date of creation. The sitter, who in this case could be grandson or great-grandson of Louis XIV, looks as one would expect a direct descendant to look. In fact, if one places these portraits...
Now, there is a good amount of time between this portrait here and these two portraits, which are obviously contemporaneous with each other. Okay, so there's like nearly a century, there's quite a long time between them. There's like about, I can't remember how much, about 80 years or something like that. But look at that resemblance. Once again, I don't think everyone looks the same, but look, it's in the eyes and it's in the mouth, almost identical. Okay, this is a strong, in my view, a strong familial trait that is being passed down in terms of heritage. So I just want to point out that's, to me, really, really strong. They look like they belong to some kind of similar family or lineage.
Portraits penned by different artists in different locations at different moments in history, side by side. The resemblance between them is both exciting and somewhat harrowing. Now, obviously, this could all be chalked up to nothing but coincidence, but what a peculiar set of circumstances to present us with such evidence. In order to believe that King Louis XIV was exactly who we have been told he is, one has to believe that. Not only were the eyewitnesses blind, they were also slanderous and treasonous. After all, we have been fed the narrative that blue blood among the monarchs of Europe demands the absolute palest of complexions obtained through purity of lineage, and yet eyewitnesses and biographers are freely describing them with a word contemporaneously used to describe dark people of African descent. Equally, we have to believe the entire population who saw validity in the suspicion of the rumor of a black love child were unable to discern the impossibility of a black baby being born to a lily white or even interracial couple. We have to believe it was normal for random people of black or mixed heritage to be allowed to don the king's armor for a portrait. We also have to believe the portraits created by royal portrait artists just so happened to depict people who bore uncanny resemblances to one another, despite being separated by decades and painted by different artists. They also just happened to...
And I think that point is significant there. All of these portraits, all four of them, have been painted by different artists, and there has been a separation of time. So that's one of the things that I felt like leaned a lot of weight towards this. If it's all the same artist or something like that, then one could argue, well, it's just facial typism there, you know, especially if, you know, in the case of the dissent, or I'm not going to say the dissenters, in the case of the mainstream narrative, where they're going to say, oh, these are just random blacks or random slaves or random Africans who just sat down for portraits. I'll be like, well, that's fine, aside from the fact that they clearly resemble each other. And they're painted by different painters, even using different styles. One of them used pastels, the other ones used oil paints, you know, like, and they all come out looking like they belong to the same family. That's when you go, no, you have to give a more satisfactory explanation. You have to provide us with a more satisfactory explanation, because these people clearly all look the same. And so we need you to kind of help us to understand that, if we're going to take that seriously as a rebuttal, you know, that these were all just like random Africans. You have to give us something.
Look like the king or queen's illegitimate daughter. Such an astounding set of coincidences have brought us to this point where we are considering this completely insane theory, but the evidence does make it one that you can't pass up without at least exploring the possibility. If you enjoyed this, don't...
So there you go. Video done. There you go. So we did it. Okay, so there's that video. And yeah, I think someone actually gave me the idea of doing more watch-alongs. So I've done one a few weeks ago with the Unk video that I did. Doing one now with this video, and I think I'm going to occasionally take a old video documentary I've done, and just do a little watch along where we can just sit and talk through it. But yeah, there you go. So I wasn't going to add too much. It added a bit, but not a huge amount to what was already there. If you haven't checked out that video already, please do. But yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of it. I hope you guys have found that enjoyable, having a discussion about that. I really do, and I'd have to say this like here and then, I can't express to you guys how fearful I've been about pursuing this subject, because I know that a lot of people find it very uncomfortable, but I'm really encouraged by the maturity and the engagement that this live stream is getting, and the people who are in the chat and having the discussions. I know there's been a couple of people who've kind of like piped in and tried to create some kind of a bit of chaos, and my moderators have gotten rid of them. But I do want to thank all of you guys, especially those of you who this video may have been challenging to just being open-minded to the information, even if you don't agree with everything. Just being open-minded, and being open to the evidence. If the evidence is there and you think it's strong, being open to it. If you don't think it's there and you think it's weak, then that's absolutely fine, as well, because we're not here to create a religion, and we're certainly not here to be some kind of a cult. The whole idea is that we're trying to learn different aspects of our history. And when I say our history, I mean our history as people who have been written out of history, that is melanated people globally. So I just want to kind of like commend you and thank you for having that kind of approach and that kind of mindset. I think it shows maturity, and I think it's one of the reasons why when people come to the King's Monologue live streams, they are always knocked off their chair about how well informed our community is, and how mature the discussions are that take place in the chat. So I've enjoyed reading the feedback that you guys have been giving it, and I've had a fantastic live stream with you guys. Hit up the likes if you've enjoyed it. It's now 11:15 here in the UK, so relatively late, but I've had a fantastic live stream. I think we went for about an hour 45 minutes, which feels like a nice time to wrap up. We're doing a bit better with these kind of shorter live streams. I'm not gonna lie, I actually quite enjoy the shorter live stream format. We'll keep this one short as well, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys. Hit up the likes before you go. Leave a kind comment for someone, and please don't be apprehensive about leaving comments in the chat, because I will always, normally within the next day or two, rewatch the live stream. I don't know why, it's just a habit I've got, but I like to read it with the chat on, because I know I miss a lot of kind of like comments when I'm actually sitting in the live stream. So I'll read through the comments, and it very often is the stuff that you guys have said that leads me down another path of kind of like research and discovery. So yeah, please do keep engaged. Thanks guys, I'm glad you've had fun. Have a fantastic one. Thank you for the really positive feedback. Thank you Patrina, Charlotte, RJ, Talia, Nate's Nan, KW, Brother Josh, Pepperin7, Surfactant for your constant giving, Nate's Nan, Jabless Forever, Sacred Grove, London MMC, KW, Ife Omar, all of you guys, thank you very much. Had a great live stream, and have a fantastic evening, and I'll see you later. Peace.